In the early penal colony of Australia, life was very difficult. Due to the morals of the time, they were afraid that people would turn into gay due to a lack of women. Believe it or not, that was a real concern. However, there couldn't be a sustainable colony without women. Thus, the British government decided to do something about that. That is to send women. England had no shortage of convicts back then. They had run out of spaces to inter them and decided to get rid of them by sending them to various places throughout the vast British Empire. The Lady Juliana was a 401-ton bark built at Whitby in 1777 and was chartered by the British government in 1789 to transport female convicts to the struggling penal colony in New South Wales. The voyage was under the command of Captain George Aitken, with Lieutenant Thomas Edgar serving as the naval agent responsible for the convicts and Richard Alley as the ship's surgeon. The ship embarked 226 female convicts, predominantly from London's Newgate prison and other county jails. The women were largely drawn from the poor and indigent classes of England. Contemporary accounts classify many of them as prostitutes, with the ship's steward, John Nichol, observing that a great proportion were transported for being disorderly, that is, streetwalkers. He had a son with one of them. The remainder were primarily convicted of petty theft, such as shoplifting, pickpocketing, or stealing household goods like clothing or a mantle. Their sentences were often a result of the Bloody Code, which prescribed transportation for what would now be considered minor offences. The Lady Juliana departed Plymouth on July 29, 1789, and arrived at Port Jackson on June 6, 1790, after a journey of 309 days, one of the slowest made by a convict ship. Let's say that the sailors weren't really in a hurry to arrive to Australia. The protracted voyage was also due to extended stops for provisions and repairs at Tenerife, Rio de Janeiro, and the Cape of Good Hope, with the ship spending 7 weeks in Rio and a month at the Cape. The other reason that the ship had so many stops and lengthy ones was that women could carry on with their profession in these ports, full of sailors. During the voyage, the ship earned its reputation as a floating brothel. Nichol recorded that when we were fairly out to sea, every man on board took a wife from among the convicts. They nothing loath. He had done the same as well. These relationships, while not legal marriages, often granted the women access to better food, provisions, and sleeping arrangements. At ports of call, the vessel became a hub of activity. Sailors from other ships, including slave vessels that altered their course, visited freely, and many of the convicts sold their services. The ship's officers made little attempt to suppress this activity, with Surgeon Richard Alley doing little to maintain discipline. Despite these conditions, the mortality rate was remarkably low, with only 4 women dying during the entire voyage. This might sound like a lot nowadays, but keep in mind that mortality was pretty high back then. Other ships had a mortality over 15%. This was attributed to the care of Agent Thomas Edgar and Surgeon Alley, who ensured rations were properly issued. Also, the vessel was kept clean and fumigated, and the women were given free access to the deck. The long stays in port also allowed for fresh food to be obtained. The Lady Juliana was the first ship to arrive at Port Jackson since the first fleet had landed almost 2.5 years prior. The colony was in a state of starvation, surviving on severely reduced rations, and had been expecting a storeship. The arrival of over 200 women, rather than vital supplies, was met with profound disappointment and scorn from colonial officials. Judge Advocate David Collins was mortified at the arrival of a cargo so unnecessary and so unprofitable as 222 females, while Lieutenant Ralph Clark famously lamented the arrival of still more damned whores. The colony's desperation was further compounded by the news the Lady Juliana carried. The storeship HMS Guardian, which was carrying vital supplies for the colony, had been wrecked after striking an iceberg. However, the Lady Juliana itself carried some provisions, and the supply ship Justinian arrived just 2 weeks later, followed by the rest of the Second Fleet, which ended the famine. The floating brothel narrative, largely based on John Nichol's account, has dominated the ship's story. More than half of the women arrived in Australia either pregnant or had already given birth in the ship. Many of the women transported on the Lady Juliana went on to become successful entrepreneurs and founding mothers of Australia. Notable convicts included Mary Wade, transported at the age of 13, who became a matriarch with tens of thousands of descendants, including the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. Elizabeth Barnsley, a shoplifter, became a leader among the women during the voyage. Anne Marsh, who had been transported to Australia for stealing a bushel of wheat, and who partnered with Surgeon Alley, became a successful businesswoman, shopkeeper, publican, and operator of an early passenger boat service. People of Australia, like everywhere in the world talk about the good old days. I assume they remember the time when they were a country of convicts and prostitutes.